People always ask if I enjoy the sex I have with clients or if I have to fake it, as if the two are mutually exclusive and the interplay between them isn't more complex. More Than Her Body is the debut novel from Lawless, a queer sex worker and sex activist working in Sydney. And Maddy, the protagonist for her novel, is a queer sex worker working in Sydney. Both Tilly and Maddy, despite being lesbians, only service men professionally. This is technically a fiction novel, but whether it is fiction, memoir, or autofiction is really unclear from reading it. And I would be unsurprised to find out that Tilly Lawless worked with the name Maddy. This book is set over 9 days in Sydney, although multiple events in it are coming from Maddy's memory, and it actually takes place over multiple years. It gives you an idea what it's like to be a sex worker in this country, as an inner city sex worker, a suburban sex worker, a sex worker in the country, and also as a sex worker who randomly gets on a flight to London and takes up a career over there for a few months. One of the things I learnt about from this novel was the link between the queer community and the sex worker community. Did not realise that it was so intertwined and overlapped before, and it was fascinating to learn about that. In many ways, when people are discriminating against sex workers, they are also discriminating against the queer community, meaning that the two communities are naturally allied. One of the things I found really interesting was the discussion around how COVID affected Maddy's work. Obviously, every country is different, and in Australia, every state is different. But most prostitutes in Australia found themselves unable to work due to lockdown laws. During the harshest lockdown here, people were allowed to have one person visit them as part of their bubble. It was kind of confusing as to who that person was. Maddy's working around these COVID laws really demonstrated what was not considered at the time, and I believe still just isn't considered by the politicians in this country. Of course we needed to lock down. Of course we needed to control the pandemic. Of course we needed to do all those things. But those things have an effect on the regular everyday people. Those things have an effect on those at the periphery of society and those most vulnerable. And sex workers are one of those people, especially as the sex worker community is made up of a lot of immigrants who maybe don't have permanent residency status, but are expected to stay in Australia without an income or support. Maddy's critique was spot on accurate. As somebody living in Australia during lockdowns, no consideration was given to how you would survive not being able to work. And this came about because of Australia's weird political setup. We have state governments and a federal government. In federal power, we have the Liberal Party, while in state power, most states in Australia, except for New South Wales, which is where this book is based, have a Labor government. And now it is the responsibility of the state to organise the lockdowns and the federal government to organise the welfare. And the federal government generally believed that we should stay open for longer than the states, meaning that the states made the call to lock down. And the federal government, because they disagreed with it, wouldn't up the welfare payments. But it's still within the realms of possibility that the state government could add provisions or handouts or whatever to make it easier for people to survive. And this just wasn't done. I think that this comes back to a real problem in politics in Australia. And while this was examined through sex work, it's true for people who were contractors, for people who owned their own business, for people who were working casually, for people who were from another country, for refugees, so on and so forth. There were so many people that fell through the holes in this situation. And it was good to hear a discussion that humanized those problems that were not highlighted. And I think were not highlighted due to the politification of the pandemic, which really shouldn't have happened. While Maddy was working in rural Australia, she worked in a mining town and she had a customer who was very anti-refugee. But Maddy didn't realise this, and she saw a tattoo of a Welsh flag on this man's arm. This led Maddy to discuss with this man the persecution of the Welsh by the English and how she loved that they were fighting back by prioritising their own language. You know, Maddy sort of puts this as white people colonising other white people and being able to bring that back to other cultures. This man, of course, was not Welsh. This man was Australian with Welsh heritage and used the Welsh flag as sort of a white identity chest beady sort of conservative person. I thought it was a wonderful discussion to compare what has happened in Wales over the years to what has happened in Australia to the Indigenous people. I thought that was a really clever device for getting white people to see the issue by giving them somebody that they associated with. However, a lot of the interactions that Maddy had felt quite forced, and this was clearly Tilly's chance to talk about the political issues that she wanted to discuss of the day. Most of these political issues I was quite on board for. I suspect that Tilly and myself will have a very large crossover in politics. In fact, judging by this, we have a huge crossover in politics. But these issues really did feel sandwiched in. For example, the discussion around the detention camps on Manus Island and how Australia treats refugees was really not essential to the plot here. And while that is a terrible and horrible issue, if you don't know about it, look it up. It's Australia's attempt to be more nasty than a civil war so that people won't flee to our country because we're ruled by cunts. This felt really forced into this story, and it was completely unnecessary. It didn't add anything to the character of Maddy. It was just an excuse for the author to talk about her political opinions. One of the issues I really wanted to hear discussed more was about sex workers' rights. Tilly Lawson is a sex worker activist and definitely has opinions on it and experience in the industry. As somebody who is looking at it outside, of course sex workers need to be treated with respect and as human beings and have rights. But there's also this issue of sex trafficking that wasn't addressed. And as somebody who knows nothing about the sex industry, it would be nice to know that that wasn't an issue, or that was an issue, or how big an issue that was, or how many times you saw that when you were working in brothels. It's an issue that I would have loved to have discussed, and it was right there to discuss, but yet it wasn't. That sort of led me to this argument around abolition of sex rights, SWERFs, or whatever you want to call them, the Nordic model, all of this. This is one of the major arguments I find that left-wing circles in Australia have with each other. Whether sex work should be decriminalised, whether the John should be criminalised for using them. What should happen in order to reduce trafficking, in order to allow sex workers to still have the right to work? It's obviously an argument where both sides have a point, and I would love to have known what's actually going on. How can we give sex workers the right and stop trafficking? And this was just not discussed. That was an issue that, as somebody on the left that sees a lot of discussion around the role of sex workers but has no experience and no knowledge and is completely ignorant of the realities of it, that was something that I would have liked to have seen addressed so that I could better form an opinion and learn on it. What are my final thoughts on this? Well, I really hope that this is not Tilly Lawless's first and last novel. I hope that she writes more. But this really did feel like a debut novel. There were some obvious mistakes, like wanting to discuss too much and knowing the frame of your story, that I think a little bit of experience would really improve. Tilly Lawless is still only 26, so there is the potential for a long and brilliant career here, and some of the writing in this was quite nice. I also worry that Maddy is basically an author insert character, and that this maybe is the only book that Tilly will write. I do hope that she goes away and she writes more books about the sex industry and maybe moves away from her character and centers women that she has met in her time. One of my issues with this was that as a queer sex worker, Maddy has sex with a lot of men in this and no women. I wondered if that was because all of the sex came from real life occurrences in the author's life and they didn't want to include any sex from ex-partners. It did feel like a kind of an erasure of her own identity in the novel, despite making constant references to her girlfriend. Although she has made some mistakes that I think could have been fixed if she had a little bit of a better editor or with a little bit more experience. I think she tried to cover too many topics and didn't focus on the topics that would have made this novel really good. Ultimately, I gave this novel 3 stars. I found it an enjoyable and informative read, if not mind-shattering.